Thought you'd never hear from me again, huh? Honestly, I never thought I would have to tell you guys any more of my crappy life. Your good friend Travis is still cursed by the voodoo curse placed upon me by my old boss King Creole. I still look like a living puppet, although at the very least I'm no longer under the control of the strings. So at least I got that going for me. I also still live with Alexandra and Olivia. Olivia treats me like an older brother, which is nice, but Alexandra is still cautious of me. Which I guess is a good segue into talking about the elephant in the room. Yes, I still have my blackouts, and yes, I still murder people. Despite anything I try to stop it, I always end up murdering some poor idiot that ends up coming into contact with me. I've still not been able to sleep, and to say my mental state is in tatters is an understatement. The only good thing about my life is that King Creole is gone forever. But of course, nothing in this trainwreck of my life ever stays the same. The flyer for the grand reopening of the half-priced voodoo shop truly rattled me and caused me to go to the site of the old voodoo shop to see if it indeed was reopening. And to see if King Creole had found a way to crawl his way out of hell and back into his shop. Suiting back up into my hoodie and leaving my room for the first time in weeks, I ran right into Alexandra. "Oh, Travis," she said, obviously startled and afraid that I was going to hurt her in some way. I looked at her with my button eyes and then looked away from her. "I'm going out. I'll be back soon," I said, pulling my hood on and walking past her, only for her to grab me by the arm and pull me back. I looked over at her with a bit of annoyance, but also understanding that she was worried about me and the fact that my blackouts are becoming much more frequent. "Don't go back there, Travis," she pleaded with me, her eyes wide and seemingly about to burst out into tears at any second. Alexandra had been like a mother to me since I had murdered my own mother and father. But she was terrified of me whenever the idea of the voodoo shop was brought up. Or when I returned late at night from one of my blackouts. "It's just going to be a quick trip. I need to see if this is true," I added, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the flyer. Handing it to her and waiting for her to read it through. She looked up at me with a worried look and carefully handed the paper back to me, moving out of the way of me as I continued on. "Please. Just be careful," she told me, holding her fists in her chest as I walked down the stairs towards the front door. Heading out of the house, I pulled my hood back on and continued on my way down to the shady side of town where the voodoo shop had been located. Since my final showdown with King Creole in the cemetery, this part of town had gone to hell quicker than I could snap my fingers. It seems he was the only thing keeping that part of town from truly turning into the rotting dump it is today. Most of the buildings are condemned and slated for destruction. Seems if you pull out the heart, the rest of the area just shrivels up and dies. Barely anyone visits this side of town, not even the junkies or homeless go here anymore. Seeing all this brought some joy to my heart. The fact that it was still dying made me optimistic that Creole was dead and buried once and for all. Until I rounded the corner and saw the imposing sight of the half-priced voodoo store, with a giant banner stating its nearing grand reopening. My heart sank into the deepest pits as I stared at the building and the sign. Swallowing the bile building up in my throat, I approached the building and pressed my face up into the glass door. The same old dusty counter and wall of voodoo dolls greeted me, causing me to back up quickly and shiver uncontrollably as all the horrible memories of the time I spent trapped inside the horror store. Stumbling back, I said nothing to myself as I staggered away and walked off in the direction of Alexandra's house. A million thoughts were flying through my head as I thought about how it could be possible that the store was having a reopening. When my phone started ringing, I almost wanted to let it go to voicemail, but for whatever reason, I reached into my pocket and pulled it out, staring at the unfamiliar number and wanting to hang up. But I breathed through my nose and answered it. "Hello?" I asked. My voice quivered a bit as I was still unsure of how to be feeling at that moment. And when that soft and smooth southern accent greeted me, I stopped in my tracks and froze like a deer caught in the headlights. "Travis, my boy. Long time no see. I need a favor from you," King Creole asked cheerily from the other end. I clutched my phone tightly as I looked around in all directions to try and see if he was somewhere in the vicinity. If my skin wasn't already so pale, I'm sure that I would have quickly become this pale when I heard his voice. "How?" I mumbled into the phone, pushing my back up against a nearby wall and sliding down it as my body seemingly shut down from sheer terror and fear of him. "I don't have time to tell you, silly boy. My goodness, how I've missed your stupid voice." He chuckled happily. I ended the call abruptly and shoved the phone into my pocket. To say that I ran back to Alexandra's house is an understatement. I'm pretty sure I could rival Usain Bolt with how fucking fast I ran. Opening the door and slamming it behind me, I breathed hard as I slid down onto the floor and just sat there and shivered hard. Alexandra poked her head from the kitchen and walked over to me, kneeling next to me and wrapping her arms around me. I wrapped my own arms around her and let out a haggard breath into her. "It's all right, Travis," she said, helping me up to my feet and walking me over to the kitchen, sitting me down and going to the kitchen to get me something to drink. Olivia meanwhile stared at me with her big soft eyes. I looked over at her and offered a pained smile. She giggled and went back to eating her lunch. Tempe was next to her and looked up at me. He had basically become the replacement doll for her after the whole mother doll drama. "What did you see?" Alexandra asked me, placing a glass of orange juice in front of me and taking a seat next to me. She wasn't very close to me. She gave me enough space, probably just afraid of me if I was about to black out. "The store is back. And he called me," I said to her, gripping the glass of vodka. My shaky hands lifted the glass up to my mouth, but I couldn't bring myself to take a sip, so I just set it back down on the table and just sat back in the chair. "That's not possible, Travis," Alexandra said, taking my hand in her own. "We saw him dragged to hell. It's not possible for him to be coming back. Not to mention that the flyer you showed me didn't even have anything on it," she told me, putting a hand on my shoulder. But I just stared back at her in confusion and horror. "What? Yes it does," I corrected her, reaching into my hoodie pocket and pulling it out again, straightening it out on the kitchen table and staring at the obvious flyer down on the table. "See? Right there," I declared, smacking the table and startling Olivia and Tempe with the force of it. "Travis, this is just a blank sheet of paper," she quickly told me, backing up in her chair away from me and holding her hands up defensively. "There isn't anything on here," she told me, taking the flyer and lifting it up again. I stared at it, but it still plainly promoted the grand reopening of the half-priced Voodoo store. "Yeah, that paper is just all white," Olivia piped up, setting her sandwich on her plate and staring at the piece of paper with squinting eyes. I stared at the two of them and looked back at the flyer. I rubbed my button eyes hard and rough and stared back at it. But it still advertised exactly what I had said it would. Silently I backed away from the kitchen and made my way upstairs, rubbing my face hard and pulling at my hair as I stepped into my room and closed the door behind me. I sat down on my bed and tried to make sense of all this. I knew for a fact I wasn't blacking out. That wasn't possible since I could remember everything so clearly. When I black out it's more like a dream nightmare that you sort of remember but can't really see all the details very clearly. I could clearly remember seeing the flyer, seeing the store, and hearing his voice over the phone. "What's happening to me?" I asked myself as I curled up in bed and tried to get some semblance of calm over myself. "Why, you're my get-out-of-jail-free card," a familiar soft and soothing voice told me, causing me to shoot up and look around the room in terror. I spun around to see where in God's name his voice was coming from, even reaching into my pocket to pull my phone out to see if he had somehow possessed my phone. But when I reached into my pocket I found nothing there. I looked down at my pants and patted both pockets and my back pocket to see where the hell my phone was. Looking around my room I soon found it on my nightstand, hooked up to its charger, where I had left it since last night. "How?" I mumbled to myself, reaching out to get the item. I suddenly froze and looked over towards the mirror attached to my nightstand, and screamed bloody murder when I saw him looking back at me. He tipped his hat to me and sat on the bed in the mirror. "Long time no see, Travis my boy." He chuckled happily, looking around my room with a hum. Nodding he looked over to me and smiled. I looked behind myself to see if he truly was behind me, but he wasn't. He was seemingly trapped in the mirror. This isn't happening. The lack of sleep is just getting to me. I tried to rationalize all this. I was hallucinating. I mean, I haven't slept in God knows how long. Maybe this was all just my decaying mind. No, this ain't no hallucination. Ain't no party trick neither, Travis. Creole chuckled, taking off his hat and brushing his hair at the same time I did it. I looked at my hand and then back at him in abject horror as we both mimicked each other's movements. "See, turning you into my little puppet wasn't just for my own entertainment." He chuckled, a little chuckle coming up from my throat as well. causing me to quickly cover my mouth. He did the same, but he simply lowered his hands and I followed his lead, dropping my handstand staring at the reflection in the mirror. He smiled back at me, his stitched-up mouth stretching long and his yellow teeth turning into those sharp teeth. "You see, son, you were a backup plan. I didn't expect to have to use you so quickly. But since y'all caused this little mess I'm currently in, I suppose I have to use you." He chuckled, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out the flyer that had caused this downward spiral. He held it up to me and smiled. "You're not that bad of an artist," he said with a smile. "I didn't make that," I shouted at him, looking behind me as Alexandra started knocking on my door. Ignoring her, I stared back at the mirror and smashed my hands against it, trying to smash that figure that haunts me into oblivion. "Oh, of course you didn't." "I did. But your skills were very helpful. Hopefully, I'll be able to train you to play the piano." He chuckled, coming closer to the mirror and tapping on the glass in a mockery of my anger. "Can't y'all see what's happening, Travis? You belong to me. You're my property and so I'm claiming you for myself." He chuckled, smashing his gloved fist against the mirror and shattered it himself. Stepping backward in terror, I stared at him as he happily climbed out of the mirror and fixed his purple tie with a happy hum. He reached down and grabbed me by the collar and shoved me against the wall. Smiling wide as he brushed some of the glass shards came off of me. "Be a good boy and put on your suit," he said with a cheery tone, tapping my cheek and shoving me towards the closet. "No. You don't control me anymore," I screamed at him, shoving him back and turning to grab a pair of scissors from my desk, only to find that my hands were now clasping the doors to my closet and pulling it open. Looking around in complete confusion, I tried to find where he had gone. The bastard was gone and nowhere to be seen. I looked down at my hands, confused as to why I was wearing gloves. Shaking my head hard, I did my best to try and get some bearing as to what was happening. Yet in the time it took me to open my eyes again, I found myself buttoning up the suit I had been forced into wearing the entire time I had been his puppet. I tugged on the gloves I wore, completely out of my control. Soon I stood up and walked back over to the closet again and reached up into the closet shelf, pulling out a box that I had never seen there before. I opened it up and pulled the top hat out. The top hat wasn't the same as Creel's. The band around it wasn't gold like King Creel's was. It was black. I lifted it up and placed it on my head and fixed it so it would be straight. Standing up with a wide smile, I walked over to the door where Alexandra was still banging. I opened it and stared at her as she backed away from me. "Travis. What are you?" she began, but I didn't let her finish. Lord knows I'll have to deal with her and her betrayal later. After all, I do have so much work to do. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. All King Creole is back. Oh, how I've missed you all. It feels so good to be back inside a body. I must say that Travis really hasn't been taking good care of himself. Walking around in this body is like trying to break into a new suit. Good lord, he's stiff as a corpse most of the time. I guess he's trying to fight me in some way. How adorable. Now I'm well aware of what you all are wondering. And yes, it does feel amazing to not have your mouth stitched up after almost 100 years. It's very relieving and enjoyable. Oh, and I suppose you all want to know how I managed to escape from Baron Samedi. Well, as with most things in life, there are plenty of loopholes in getting out of tough situations. You all assumed that once I was dragged into the cold ground, that would be the end of me. And normally it would be. I even considered that it was the end of the line for all King Creole. And while my poor old body was laid to its earthly rest, my soul easily escaped from the Baron's clutches. I had always envisioned that something may happen to my old body. And while making Travis into a puppet was mostly for my own enjoyment, there was a practical reason for doing it as well. Taking over Travis's body would be the simplest way for me to escape from the Baron's clutches. And now that I'm back to the lovely world of the living, I have so much unfinished business to attend to. After thoroughly startling Alexandra with my attire, I pushed my way past her and ignored her continued annoying questions. I did not have any time to deal with the traitor at that very second. So I just continued onwards until a familiar little voice caught my attention just before I was out the door. "Wow, Travis. You look just like Mr. King Creole." Olivia's sweet innocent voice rang out as I put my hands on the doorknob. Turning to look at the living room, I smiled nice and wide when I saw her face. Much less so when I saw her playing with that template doll I had Travis use to punch in for work. "Well, what can I say?" I asked with a chuckle, tipping my hat to the little girl as I walked over to her. She smiled with all the love in the world towards me. I could tell just from that how much she had grown attached to Travis. Smiling and staring down at her, I got on my knees and patted her on the head. "Tell your mother not to wait up for me. I'll be gone for a bit. But don't fret. I'll be back to give y'all a big thank you gift," I said with a cheery grin, which she responded to with a childlike gasp and to wrap her arms around me. Staring at the template she had left on the floor, I nearly wanted to spit on the foul thing. But hearing Alexandra rushing down the stairs, I quickly stood and headed out the door. No time at all to be dealing with whatever it is she thinks she can do to stop me. My first stop on my long road to rebuilding everything began at the police department. Strolling into the office, the front desk worker stared up at me with terror. I responded back with a smile, leaning against the desk and taking off my hat. "Mama always said to respect the police." "Hello, dear." I greeted her, taking the hat and placing it down on the desk. "Go on and bring me your chief, please. I do believe we have business to attend to," I told her. She nodded quickly and started running off to go find the old man. Taking my hat and placing it back on my head, I drummed my fingers against the desk in anticipation. "So it really is you?" A voice broke the silence. I looked over at the old man and gave him a nice wide smile. God, it feels so good to finally do that and not feel like my mouth is about to be ripped apart. "In the newly living flesh," I exclaimed with a good chuckle. Spinning on my heels and showing off Travis's body. The boy might look like me in some ways, but at the same time, it's like wearing a very expensive suit that you must simply wear at all times. What could you possibly want with us? You abandon us for God knows how long and just waltz back in here in a new body and act like nothing ever happened, Creole. Your deal with us is off," the old man declared, his weathered and exhausted face trying to muster up any kind of emotion that he could. But he made a bad mistake. "My deal with all of you is off, huh? That means yours too," I said with a smile. To which his face showed an instant sign of regret. He quickly raised a hand to protest. Only for his hand to fall off his wrist and crumble into dust. His entire body began to collapse in on itself as he stumbled towards me. I backed away from him. I wore all black after all. I didn't want to get his ashes all over me. The old chief slowly but surely collapsed into a pile of clothes and ash on the ground. His screams of death fading into an almost echo-like wind. "Did you do to him?" the female officer from the front desk asked, and she lifted up her gun and pointed it at me. I looked back at her with a warm smile and approached her. Her finger twitching on the trigger as I walked closer to her. A rookie. But at least she knew who I was. I'm simply ending his and my deal. No more long lifespan for him. I shrugged, looking down at the ashes strewn about the floor of the station. I looked back at her with a smile and walked closer to her, taking the gun from her trembling hands and tossing it over my shoulder. "You wanna be chief?" I asked, looked at me with bewilderment, and I delicately placed the old man's badge in her hands. Closing them around her and tipping my hat to her. It does feel good to instill that sense of fear into someone other than Travis. I could tell she was running over everything that had happened to her. She looked at me and quickly handed the badge back to me, causing me to raise a brow as I took it back. "No. Not like this," she said, puffing her chest out a bit to try and show me that she meant that. I nodded and offered her a genuine smile. "Not many like her out there. She's honest and wants to work her way up." "Fair enough, darlin'." I nodded, tipping my hat to her and tossing the badge up and down with my hand. "When y'all figure out who's succeeding him, gimme a call. Clearly, a new deal is needed to be hammered out. Unless y'all want the crime wave to continue." I chuckled as I turned and walked off, tossing the badge over my shoulder and listening to it rattle around on the floor as I walked off towards the entrance. With the police situation at least temporarily out of my way, I next headed off towards the site of my lovely Voodoo shop. Enjoying my way there, I was suddenly hit with a splitting headache. It really threw me for a loop as it had been decades since I last experienced any kind of pain. Grabbing the wall as I slid down it, I clutched at my head as I looked up. The world began spinning, and soon enough I had that bastard trapped in my head and I was able to take back control. I gasped and panted as hard as I could as I got myself to my feet and looked around. Him in control felt horrible. It was like being paralyzed as some alien creature forces you to walk, talk and act like it. Worse still was being locked up in my own mind. I was able to see the me that exists when I black out. And let's just say he's as terrifying as I feared him to be. He's horrible, and the less said about him the better. Staggering to my legs, I looked around and stumbled forward to try and find a spot to collect myself and just think. I elected to go to a nearby park. Lucky for me, no one ever goes there except to walk their dogs and let them crap all over the place and not pick it up afterward. Looking around as I walked through the chain link gate, I rushed to the nearest bench and just sat there hyperventilating. I can't go back to the house, I mumbled to myself, jumping at any noise I heard. I'll just put them all into danger. I mumbled to myself. What, going to turn into a hobo? That familiar southern voice asked me. I turned and saw him sitting on the bench to my right. His legs crossed and a smile on his face. I shot up and was about to run when I realized it wouldn't do me any good. So I just sat back down in defeat and tried to put as much distance between us as possible. Maybe I will. As long as it ensures you don't hurt them, I said, looking at him with a scowl. He touched his chest, as if he were offended, and scat at me. Me? The one to hurt them? Surely your little friend behind you is the one you should be worrying the most about. He pointed behind me. Following his finger, I was greeted by my own face smiling nice and wide back at me. Flinching back, I stared in horror as the image of myself stared at me with the same creepy smile Creole had always reserved for me. This couldn't be happening. I really was losing my mind. Come on, Travis. You've left me in the dark for so long, and it takes him to show up to finally come and let me see again. I asked myself. This Travis was the one that murdered my parents and God knows who else. How he appeared before me was evidence enough. His black suit drenched in blood splatters, and the crazed smile I had seen from myself just before being able to wrangle control back. This can't be happening. I mumbled to myself. Trapped between the two. Creole put his arm around me and held me in a chokehold of sorts while he rubbed my head. I tried to wrangle free from him, but it was for nothing, as whenever I tried to move, other Travis pointed a sharp kitchen knife at me. Oh, it is, Travis my boy. Creole hummed as he held me in the uncomfortable stranglehold. And when his hands went towards the stitches across my neck, both me and other Travis instantly froze in our tracks. The smile on other Travis dipped a bit as he looked up at Creole. I see both of you understand what happens if I rip out y'all's stitches. Maybe that'll make you both behave yourselves, he said with a chuckle, shoving me away and into other Travis's hands. You wouldn't do that, I said quickly, shoving the other me away and looking back at my former boss and former abuser. You need my body, you wouldn't dare touch me, I quickly shouted, standing from the bench and wanting to leave, only to find myself sitting right back down the second I started walking away. True, Creole said with a soft and happy hum. But all I need is you two to slip and allow me back in the pilot seat. You're fighting a war on two fronts, Travis. And you can't hold us both down. Creole giggled, other Travis joining in with him as he realized just what this opportunity meant for him. You squish me down, he'll take over. Squish him down, I'll finish up my business, he said, folding his hands and placing them on his crossed legs. He's right, Travis, the other me said in excitement, bringing the knife up to my neck and causing me to stay completely still for fear of him even nicking the stitches on my throat. I've been eyeing that little family we've got back at home for a very long time. Maybe now I'll finally get a chance. He giggled, causing me to bash his face in with the back of my head, causing him to drop the knife and grip his nose. Now children, no fighting, Creole scolded the two of us, causing us to stare back at him and forcibly quieted down. He stood and fixed his tie, brushing his black hair out of his face. I'll let you take the reins for now, Travis. But the second you start slipping, I'll finish what I started here. He chuckled with a smile, tipping his hat to me as he seemingly vanished into thin air before my eyes. Other Travis also disappeared when I looked behind myself. I never felt more lost or terrified in my entire fucked up life. Why didn't I go to college? I ask myself that every day. But honestly, with my luck, I'd get shackled with some professor that wants to brainwash me or something. That would really be my luck for that to happen. As for now, I'm currently stealing the Wisconsin Pie from a coffee shop a decent way from both the Voodoo store and from Alexandra's shop. Hopefully, it's enough time to let one take control and regain some strength to stop them from doing anything. Alexandra. If you're reading this, I'm so sorry for everything. Honestly, I really wish you and Olivia could have just moved as far away as possible from King Creole as you could have. Then you two could live a nice normal life. Not shackled with a useless ex-voodoo puppet that either wants to kill you or use you for some horrible voodoo ritual. I just wish I could tell you both how sorry I am. And how badly I want to slice your throats open and watch you both plead and beg for mercy. Coming for both of you. Oh dear, is this working? Oh, it is. Hello all. My name is Alexandra. I'm sure Travis has talked at length about who I am. I do apologize for taking over Travis's account, but he hasn't been seen or heard from since he attacked me and Olivia. Oh dear, I probably shouldn't have said that. Well, I suppose I might as well fill you all in on what has happened. Ever since we defeated King Creole, Travis has been in a terrible downward spiral. I'm sure he has filled you all in on his little late night episodes. I've had the misfortune of walking in on his return. It terrifies me when I see his deranged face staring at me. Those button eyes and his chalk white skin send me back to the decades I lived under Creole's control. While what I went through was nowhere as bad as how Travis got it, it was still a horrible experience. Being turned into a doll is something I cannot begin to describe to all you sweet people. I can best describe it as being unable to move, talk, or anything. I believe that's known as being paralyzed. The one thing I could do, however, was communicate with the other dolls. Not through talking, mind you, but through our thoughts. We each could talk to and feel each other's thoughts. It's difficult to explain, especially for me, but it was like the voice you have in your head of yourself being able to talk to another person. I tried to cheer Travis up in any way I could, but he just stayed in his room and continued his downward spiral. The day I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow was the night when I woke up to check on him and saw him standing outside of Olivia's room. Hand on the doorknob and knife clutched firmly in his hand. He looked at me with a smile that chilled me to the very bone. It was like King Creole's. I approached him and gently took him into my arms. I hugged him tightly, hoping that he would get the murderous rage out on me instead of Olivia. I held him for what felt like an hour, my heart practically pounding out of my chest. But soon he dropped the knife and wrapped his arms around me. Patting his back, I carefully led him back to his bed and sat him down in it. I know he can't sleep, but it's better than having him threatening to hurt my Olivia. Since then I've made sure to keep an extra eye on him. And well, it looks like I didn't keep a close enough eye on him. Travis has been sneaking out much more frequently. Not just at night for his little murders, but going out until the brink of dawn and coming back without so much as a word. He wouldn't speak to me or anything, and it caused me to wonder what he could possibly be doing. That question was answered when one night, as I was tucking Olivia into bed, I heard him talking to himself. He had left his door open a crack and I was able to listen in on him. Past the ramblings and giggles, I kept hearing him repeat the same phrase over and over. It's almost time. Almost time. Almost time. Over and over again he said that. What could he have meant? I racked my brain all night trying to think of what he could possibly be walking about. A familiar friend brought some much needed clearance. I know how much you all seem to love the little template doll. And I must confess he is quite the cute little thing. And he seemingly cares deeply for Travis, so he was able to fill me in on what he had been doing all this time. Travis had been going to the Voodoo shop night after night and seemingly talking to King Creole in some capacity. That's why I tried to stop Travis from going that morning. Seeing the blank sheet of paper he called a flyer sent chills up my spine. Finally, when he emerged from his room dressed up as King Creole, it finally hit me. He had managed to claw his way back to us. Sometimes I wish I could just take Olivia and run from all this. But I look at Travis like a son. And any parent should help their children when they are in desperate need for help. So after Travis had left the house, I quickly called Olivia in sick for the day and kept her home and near to me. She was just as wagged on. Olivia fell asleep in my arms and I held her as she did, keeping her close and watching as the minutes ticked on and on. I nearly fell asleep myself when I heard the sounds of tapping on the window. I flinched awake and looked towards the window right next to the bed. And the smiling pale face of Travis met me. His red painted cheek so stark against his pale face. I had barely any time to think before he began smashing his head against the window over and over again. Olivia startled awake and quickly clung to me, trying to figure out what was going on. I quickly stood up and ordered her to run to her room and lock the door. "But I don't want to leave you, Mommy," she screamed hysterically, clinging to my legs and refusing to budge as I grabbed the knife from under my pillow. I looked down at her and felt like I was already being stabbed in my heart. I didn't want to leave her either. But I had no other option. I quickly bent down and kissed her. "It'll be okay. I'll come to get you. Just go, please," I pleaded with her, holding her adorable little face in my hands. She looked at me and quickly nodded, fetching the template from my bed and quickly running for the door. I next turned my attention to Travis, who was now stabbing his way through the window, finally smashing his way in and climbing inside. He was no longer wearing the hate, but the horrible smile was still plastered on his face. "Alexandra. Just the Brit I was looking for." He chuckled at me, putting his hand into his hair and giving it a good stroke. "That boy so desperately needs a good haircut." He took a step towards me, and I quickly jutted the knife out towards him. "Please, Travis. I know you don't want to do this," I said, my hands trembling despite my efforts to the contrary. His smile grew wider as he chuckled at me, stepping closer and clutching his knife with such intensity I thought he was going to break the wooden handle. "Just be lucky the little brat isn't here. I would just love to gut her like a little lamb," he snickered, planting his knife into the headboard of my bed and dragging it across it as he stepped closer. I swallowed the bile building up in my mouth and continued to give up ground, staring at his button eyes and imaging back to when I was first turned into a doll. And just the horror I felt as I stared into Creel's eyes as he laughed at me for my stupid mistake. Well, I won't ever make that same mistake ever again. Quickly holding my knife out, I charged at him, catching off guard and bashing him in the head with the handle. He stumbled to the side, and with an animal-like growl, he pulled the knife from the wooden headboard and slashed at me. Receiving a glancing blow on my arm, I bit my lips hard so as not to give him the satisfaction of any noise from me. Clutching my arm, I saw that he was winding up for another swipe at me, so I ducked and rushed him again, planting my head firmly in his stomach. I think it's called a headbutt. Whatever it's called, it got him to retch and stumble to the floor. Acting quickly, I kicked the knife away from his hand, only to receive a sharp and painful stab to my foot from a small knife he was hiding in his pocket. This time I let out a pained screech. Bending over, I gritted my teeth while he giggled, as if he had just done the most hilarious thing he could think of. Undeterred, I shrugged off the stab and pointed my own knife at his throat. I know for a fact that is his weak spot, and he seemingly knew too as he quickly froze in his place. "You wouldn't dare," he chuckled, his demeanor changing before my very eyes. His crazed smile and little giggles ceased. A more refined and dignified tone took over in his voice. A hint of a southern accent. "King Creole. Wouldn't I? I won't let either of you harm me or Olivia," I said calmly, despite the pain I felt from the blood leaking out of me. He smiled at me. The smile Creole gives when he knows he has an edge over someone. "I would never hurt Olivia. I've told you as such. But you. Oh, I and the other Travis would be more than happy to see your traitorous blood spilled everywhere," he chuckled, shifting a bit and pressing his neck right up against the knife I had against it. My brows raised as I backed the knife out. He smiled and easily pushed me off. "If you really wanted to hurt us, you would have used that sharp part on us," he chuckled again, standing up and patting himself off. Pulling that black top hat from seemingly nowhere, he placed it on his head and pulled his fingers across the brim of it. Standing up and using the bed to keep my balance as I lifted my injured leg up like a horse, I stared at him. "That may be true. But you no longer deserve to walk on this earth, Creole," I said to him, placing my leg down and grunting as I applied pressure to it. Walking up to him and meeting him eye to buttons. "And so help me, I will save Travis from you." He offered me a smile and a tsk, wagging his finger at me. God, he can be so condescending when he thinks he has the upper hand. He reached out and grabbed me by the throat, giving it a hard squeeze and stealing any air I had in my lungs as he held me a good 3 feet off the floor. "And who are you to tell me that?" he asked, his cordial tone dropping, and that animalistic snarl that he had when he was enraged. "Shouldn't you be dead? Perhaps you'd like to be the actual age you should be. Remind me again, Alexandra. Aren't you supposed to be almost 130? He asked me, bringing my face mere inches from his. "And you aren't?" I asked him, still defiant to him. He raised a brow and chuckled. He tossed me to the floor and walked over to me, kicking me in the head with his shiny dress shoes. The world spun as I fell fully to the floor. He climbed on top of me and squished my face into the floor. I closed my eyes and tried to force back tears, but they started flowing. "You dare to tell me that? You, the woman who abandoned her children and came to America all by herself, left the poor things with your low-life alcoholic husband?" He snarled in my ear, pressing my face down deeper into the floor while he relished my soft crying. "Would you like to know what he did to them?" he cooed, lifting me up by my hair and staring at me with his button eyes. "No, I don't. Because Olivia is my daughter. She's the only family I need," I shouted at him, causing him to flinch at my response. He bashed my face down on the floor again, my vision going blurry and dark from the hit. "I gave her to you. And I can easily rip her away from you," he shouted at me, standing up and walking past me, heading towards the bedroom door. I looked up in horror and struggled to push myself up and save Olivia. Turns out I didn't have to, since I heard a thud. Looking up, I saw that Travis's body had slumped to the floor and was twitching violently. Cautiously, I pushed myself up and grabbed one of the knives from the floor. Limping over to the body, it suddenly stopped twitching and shot up, grabbing me by the arms. "Alexandra, you need to lock me up. Stop me from doing anything else to you. Please." Travis begged me. I could tell it was him by just his voice and mannerisms. I quickly got down on the floor and grabbed him by the shoulders. "Travis, you know that can't stop Creole from escaping," I told him in a soft tone to calm him down. He stared at me for a moment and seemingly knew that I was right. Looking at me, he began heaving and hiccuping. Since he can't really cry tears, that's all he can really do. I wrapped my arms around him and patted his back. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he whimpered, hugging me tightly and crying into my neck. "This poor boy has gone through so much. And it pains me to see just how much he has deteriorated since I was first brought back as a human." "It's okay. It's okay," I told him, trying to calm him down enough to get him to open up about what Creole was planning. When he finally did, he slumped a bit as he seemingly was trying to remember anything about what the voodoo creature was planning. "The voodoo shop. That's all I know, really. He wants to reopen it. I can only assume it's to get his power back and maybe put my soul and other Travis's soul in a doll," he said quickly, standing up and looking around, confused and scared as all hell. He then looked at me and grabbed my shoulders. "Please help me. I can't stay here. It's too dangerous for me here. You have to help," he said quickly, reaching into his suit pocket and handing me his cellular phone. Before quickly running towards the window and jumping out of it. Horrified, I ran to see what had happened to him. But as I got to the window, I saw him running off down the street at full sprint. Looking down at his phone, I struggled with opening it and finally figured it out. His password was simple as well, and soon I learned about all of you. Thank you all for helping him in the limited ways you all can. But now it looks like it's up to me and Olivia to help save Travis. She would not take no for an answer when I told her that I was going to try and help him. She loves him like a brother and she wants to save him. But another unlikely ally has also made himself known. The Voodoo template. In fact, he has suggested getting help from an old friend of ours. Of course, it would be risky to try and contact her, but at this rate, Mary is all we have left to try and help Travis. So, we will perform a seance to try and summon her. Hopefully, she will help us in any way that she can. We've made a terrible mistake. An absolute and horrible mistake. After Travis fled my home, I took Olivia and the template doll out of the house and headed with them to the voodoo shop. Why would I go there? I hear you all asking me. Well, please allow me to explain. The voodoo store acts like a giant mousetrap for spirits. If you are killed in there or are cursed in any way, your soul is forever trapped inside the dusty walls. So that means that even though she was finally freed from her imprisonment, Mary is still trapped inside its walls. Taking Olivia and the template there was difficult to do. While I know that Olivia absolutely adores the voodoo shop since it gave her me and a friend in the form of King Creole, the things I've seen happen in there still haunt me. But if it meant that we could save Travis, I was willing to do it. Arriving at the shop and seeing that no one was near or inside it, we made our way inside. What Travis said was true. The voodoo store was reopening. And by the look of things, it was going to open very soon. Letting Olivia go and roam around the uninhabited store, I set about getting the seance ready and prepared. I still had the knife on me for safety, so I set that on the counter and began to pull some candles from the purse I had brought with me. Unlike Travis, I would hopefully be able to do this without reviving any vengeful spirits. "Mommy, can I keep this?" Olivia asked me, running to me and holding up a shrunken head. Recoiling a bit, I quickly took it from her hands and set it on the counter away from her. "No, Olivia. We aren't here for a shopping trip. We're here to try and save Travis," I told her, taking her hand and pulling her closer to me. She pouted a bit, but she knew that I was being serious, so she nodded. She pulled the template doll from her little pocket and held him close while I lit the candles. Now the other problem with the voodoo shop is just how many people have died here. The shop has been open since the 1920s. You can imagine just how many people King Creole has had his fun with. So doing a seance here risks other angry ghosts and spirits trying to latch onto any trace of the other side that they can. So we had to be careful. Lighting the candles, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Mary Simmons, I summon you forth to communicate with us. If you are so willing," I softly spoke in the dimly lit room. I held my breath as I waited for any kind of response. It felt like a million angry eyes were staring at me. They no doubt were jealous of me for getting a second chance. "You don't have to use my last name, you know. He never let anyone named Mary inside the shop anyway." A soft, snarky voice spoke to me. Opening my eyes, the form of a blonde woman came into shape. Smiling at her, I chuckled and nodded. That was true, even the name Mary sent Creole into a violent mood swing. "It's good to finally meet the famous Mary," I chuckled, the woman offering me a smile and fluffing up her blonde curls a bit. She looked stunning. I can see why Creole had her turned into a porcelain doll. Even if he was furious with her betrayal, her beauty was simply stunning. "I take it this is about Travis?" she asked me, coming around the counter and joining us on the other side. She looked down at Olivia with a raised brow. My little girl looked up at her and waved a shy little hand at her. That put a smile on her face. "How can I help?" she asked. "Creole has possessed his body. Not to mention the lack of sleep and everything that's happened to him has broken his sanity," I explained, sighing as I twirled my hair around my fingers. "I'm worried about him," I mumbled, chewing on my thumbnail. I could tell. The other spirits are really riled up about the fact Creole is back, Mary explained, looking around at the dusty and insidious store and sighed as she crossed her arms across her chest. "I'm going to be honest with you, Alexandra. It looks very bleak. Travis isn't strong enough to fight off the both of them. All it'll take is Creole to get the final upper hand and he'll be able to suppress both of them," the ghostly figure of the woman explained. I sighed hard and shook my head. "Is there any way for us to stop him? Perhaps Baron Samedi could help us again?" I asked her, but I received a shake of the head from her. "Why not? Creole promised him a percentage of the souls he brings into the shop to him. Baron is taking the bribe and turning the other cheek," Mary explained softly. My heart sank through the floorboards and right into the basement. How could that bastard have really found a way out of this? "Is there really nothing we can do?" I asked her. Really begged from her. The look she gave me was one of forlorn hope and then one of absolute terror as her gaze went past mine and towards the door. Raising a brow, I followed her gaze right into the button eyes of Travis. Well, I didn't even have to try and trick you into coming here, did I?" He giggled at me. A soft southern accent in his voice. That sent a chill up my spine when I realized he was wearing that all-black top hat. I reached out and pulled Olivia close to me while she instinctively pushed her face into my stomach. King Creole took a further step into his shop and looked around, his button eyes falling squarely on Mary. "Hello, Charles. Got to say you look better with some color on you," Mary said snarkily. A smile on her face. She thought because it was through a seance he wouldn't be able to touch her or retaliate. But she underestimated him. Because just as she said that, he reached out and grabbed her by the throat, seemingly pulling her out of the spirit realm and back into the human one. "And, Mary. It feels so good to be able to punish you again," he growled happily. Mary stared at herself in disbelief. Really, so did I. I had never heard of being able to literally pull someone back from the dead. But King Creole is always full of surprises. Which made the next part that much more surprising to me. He smashed her face against the counter. At which point her face shattered into a million little glass shards. I let out a scream at that, grabbing Olivia and holding her as close to me as I possibly could. Mary's body cracked all over the place before she crumbled away into dust. I watched as the pieces seeped into the creaky floorboards and disappeared. I looked up at Creole, who spun on his heels to look at me. A big wide smile plastered on his face. Olivia squeezed me hard, terrified about what might be happening to us. In turn, she hugged me so hard that she dropped her doll onto the floor. We both backed up to the wall as Creole followed slowly after us. "You know, Alexandra, my dear," he said with a chuckle, his dress shoes tapping on the hard wooden floor as he approached me and Olivia. "A lot of the dolls were very jealous that you were chosen instead of them," he said with a little giggle as he kept approaching us. His foot stepping on the voodoo doll and looking down at it. "What is this disgusting thing doing here?" he snarled. To which, Olivia let me go and quickly scooped up her doll. "Don't hurt him, Mr. King Creole. He's my dolly," she said, quickly backing up into my arms. I looked at Creole as he was. I said, keeping Olivia close to me and making sure she didn't so much as a step away from near me. The second she got out of sight of the both of us was the second I stopped being human, or worse, stopped living. He looked over to me as he got behind the counter, that sickening smile on his face. "Well, once I'm done dealing with Travis and his annoying alter ego, I'll open up the shop. And once the shop is open, I had the glorious idea of opening other voodoo stores around the country." I thought to myself, why have all your eggs in a basket? He chuckled, reaching down behind the counter and pulling out 2 glass bottles and a sharp knitting needle. "How could you possibly run all those shops by yourself?" I scoffed, ever carefully reaching behind my back for the knife I had tucked in my purse. Creole let out a soft chuckle as he lifted up the knitting needle and tapped the tip with his finger. "I do have friends, Alexandra. You know that. Very good friends, in fact. Monsieur LeBlanc and Mr. Sinclair, for instance. They would love the opportunity to join my business. Once their own affairs are in order, of course." He chuckled, lifting the needle up and jamming it into his temple. I gasped and quickly covered Olivia's eyes as she screamed in terror. I watched as he twisted the needle around in his head and slowly pulled it out. A wispy, almost fluffy-like source of light exited with the tip of the needle. It was a bright and fiery red, seemingly wanting to escape from the needle as Creole brought it over to the bottle and stuck the needle with the light into it. "I'm sure you can figure out who that is." Creole chuckled as he pulled the needle away quickly and sealed it with a cork. The light inside the bottle grew bright and began angrily smashing itself against the bottle with minimal effect to it. "That could only be the other Travis. What are you planning on doing with them?" I shouted, letting my hands let go of Olivia and pointing an accusing finger at the voodoo puppet. He looked at me with a chuckle as he once again drove the needle into his head. This time he drove it in deeper, all the while staring at me with a smile that turned my blood cold. Slowly he pulled out another wispy light. This one was blue and made no attempt at resistance. "Aw, poor little Travis seems to have given up," he chuckled, placing Travis's soul into the other bottle and placing the cork into it. The light didn't move at all in the bottle, it barely even glowed, unlike the red one which shone like a lantern. I was thinking of turning them into dolls. Maybe keeping them on the shelf as a little fun knick-knack. He shrugged with a chuckle. He put his hands on the counter and smiled at me. I took the opportunity to strike, pulling the knife from my purse and driving it into his hand, pinning him to the counter. Quickly I picked up Olivia and made it like lighting out of there, while Creole screamed and raved after us. At this point, I don't know what to do. It feels like I've exhausted all my options and Travis is now trapped in a bottle back in the voodoo store. And Mary has seemingly been completely wiped from the realm. He has a body back, and it'll be only a few more days before the Voodoo store will reopen. I'm at my wit's end. Do any of you think you can help us? Wait. Olivia is screaming. Olivia had good reason to scream, as when I quickly reached her room she was hiding under her bed from the figure that was sitting at her little table and seats where she has tea parties. I swallowed hard as I approached the figure. But when it turned to me I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Baron Samedi. I sighed, bowing a bit to the Voodoo Loa and ushering Olivia to come out from under her bed. Showing her that everything was okay. She poked her head out further and carefully slid out and ran to me. She hugged my waist and buried her face into my dress. Bonjour, madam. Seems you've had a little run-in with the cockroach. He chuckled in his shrill voice. He got up and removed his top hat to me. I nodded and patted Olivia's head as she whimpered audibly. I guess her notion of King Creole being her friend has finally been shattered. Which is just fine by me. He said that the two of you have a deal with each other, I said with a tone of betrayal. He had been the one to decry King Creole as nothing more than a cockroach and had seemed more than delighted to drag the undead Voodoo King back down to hell where he belongs. So why would he let him go? I wouldn't call it a deal with him. It's a deal with his mama. The Baron chuckled, pulling a cigar from nowhere and chomped his disgusting yellow teeth down on the item. Lighting up the item he puffed on it for a good few seconds before finally finishing what he had been saying. His mama had a change in heart and wanted her sonny boy back up here. So I looked the other way in exchange for a little tribute from him. He shrugged, tapping his cigar and dropping ash all over my floors. You can't do that. He was dead and buried, he shouldn't be allowed to roam any longer. I pleaded to the Loa, but he just looked at me and raised a brow, taking the cigar out of his mouth and blowing a disgusting cloud of smoke into my face. I could say the same of you, bitch. You shouldn't be alive neither, and yet here you are. Walking and talking to me. He snuffed, placing the cigar back in his mouth and continuing to puff away. He had a point. I might as well be the same age as Creole is, and yet I walk around as if I haven't aged since I first walked into his dreadful shop. Monsieur Baron, please. There has to be something you can do to save Travis. I begged from him. At Travis's name, the Baron looked at me with a puzzled look and removed his cigar. Travis. The loose end? He asked me. I looked up at him in a bit of confusion. Travis is certainly a lot of things, but I've never exactly considered him a loose end. Whatever that meant. I simply nodded since I just hoped that it was my Travis we were talking about. I see. So that's how the cockroach shit is walking around without a body. He just took one over. The Baron nodded to himself. Yes, I butted in quickly. He's taken out Travis's soul and has the body all to himself now, I said. This revelation greatly interested the Baron, who nodded and stroked his chin with his gloved hands. I see. I see. Tell you what, girlie, get me both of that boy's souls and I'll see if I can't help him some. He nodded with a chuckle, reaching a hand out to shake mine. But I refused his hand. Instead, nodding a verbal agreement. I've dealt with Voodoo long enough to know to never agree to a concrete agreement. Just before the Baron left he took a look at the doll that Olivia was clutching for dear life. He got down on her level and beckoned for her to come to him. Olivia whimpered loudly as she gripped me for dear life. But slowly I coaxed her into going over to the Voodoo Loa. Let me see your dolly. I promise I won't hurt him. He chuckled. Olivia looked down at her template doll and carefully handed him over to Samedi. He took the voodoo doll and examined it. His eyes opened ever so slightly the more he looked at it. He gave a happy giggle and handed the doll back to Olivia. That little thing has a mighty big secret. He chuckled as he disappeared into a cloud of smoke. I hugged Olivia as she came running back to me. Rubbing her back I looked down at the little template doll. Why was he suddenly getting so much attention? It's true that he certainly is an odd one. Unlike the other dolls I used to talk to in the shop, the template never talks about his former life. He's like a vault in the way that he never opens up about himself. What could the Baron mean in the template having a big secret? Deciding to leave Olivia at home by herself was one of the hardest decisions in my new life. I could have left her with a sitter, but I trust her more by herself than her with a stranger. She is safer there than being anywhere near the Voodoo store. While that puts me in danger without her to protect me from King Creole, it's worth it as long as she stays safe. Leaving her with food and a tight hug and a kiss, I went off to the Voodoo store. Knife in purse and nothing more than my determination. Arriving at the store, my heart sank to the floor seeing that after so long, the half-priced Voodoo store was now open again. I approached the door and peered into the glass. Seeing Creole in Travis's body talking to a new customer. I took a deep breath as I entered the store. Both of them stopped mid-conversation and looked at me. Creole kept his outward smile, but I knew he was furious at me. Like he usually is. The customer, however, just shrugged and went back to talking to the Voodoo salesman. Like I was saying, I was hoping you could get rid of my ex-wife. The bitch is sucking me dry of alimony, and I want her gone. The man said, leaning on the counter and looking at Creole like he was going to save whatever poor life that he was living at that moment. What? Oh, yes, of course. The Voodoo King chuckled, fixing his tie and patting the counter free of dust. Sending the man sputtering and coughing. Creole smiled and reached behind the counter and pulled out a notepad. I simply need her details. Name, address, blood type, that sort of stuff. He said with a chuckle and handed the man the notepad. He stopped coughing and looked annoyed at Creole, but took a pen from his pocket and began scribbling on the notepad. Muttering to himself and finally ripping the page and handing the scrap to the Voodoo King. Creole took the paper and crumbled it up in his hand. A puff of smoke coming in between his fingers. When he opened up his hand, nothing remained of the paper but ash. And it is done. Creole hummed as he blew the ashes into the man's face. She sputtered again and stared at Creole with nothing but anger in his eyes. But he simply turned around and walked away. Muttering to himself and walking past me. Rudely bumping his shoulder into mine and continuing without even saying he was sorry. Quite the charmer, I mumbled as I walked over to Creole. He stared at me with that grin and drummed his fingers on the counter. I took a deep breath and cracked my knuckles like I've seen cool people do on the Netflix. I want Travis's souls, I demanded. My. Look at you demanding something from me in my own shop. He hummed with acid in his voice. Standing up straight and reaching behind the counter. He placed the 2 bottles down in front of me. The blue soul still remained motionless, while the red one continued to fruitlessly smash itself against the bottle to escape. Why do you want them? He asked with a chuckle, lifting the blue one up and giving it a hard shake. None of your business. This is a business transaction. I have stated my desired product and you must give me what I desire. I said, clutching the straps of my purse tightly as I mustered up all the courage I had. You say it is none of my business. But darling, you're currently in my shop. Alone. With nothing but that little knife in your purse. What can you possibly do to me? He chuckled, taking the bottles back and placing it back down behind the counter. I huffed, knowing that he was right, but I still had an ace up my sleeve. Taking a deep breath, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife. He looked at me with a pleased smile and a giggle as I raised it up. Of course, he didn't expect me to throw the weapon at the wall behind him. Crashing into the bottles of souls and sending a couple crashing down. You goddamn bitch. He shouted, reaching up and grabbing a straggling soul and then another. While he was preoccupied, I jumped over the counter and searched behind it for the bottles. Only to come to the horrible realization that there was nothing there behind the counter. The sound of his chuckles left my blood frozen. You really didn't think I would have his souls out in the open, did you? He snickered as he shoved each soul back in its respective bottle and then back up on the shelf. I looked back at him and swallowed the bile building up in my throat. I was caught there with nothing to show for it. And in my horror he gripped me by the shoulder and pulled me to the feet, spinning me around to stare at me with his button eyes. Seeing Travis's face with such anger and hatred towards me nearly broke my heart into a million pieces. The bell to the front door jangled and both of us looked over at the entrance. And my jaw dropped as Olivia struggled to push the door open. Finally, she quickly shuffled into the store, her little arms squeezing the template doll in her arms. Don't hurt my mommy, she said with all the courage a 7-year-old can have. Creole looked at her and then at me and snuffed, a long and annoyed chuckle coming from his throat. He pushed me away and towards Olivia. I stumbled forward and she quickly ran to me and hugged me hard. Why must you insist on bringing that thing here? Creole scoffed, his buttoned gaze looking down at the template doll in Olivia's hands. She pouted and let me go. Going over to him and pointing up at him with an accusing finger. He's the real Charles, she said angrily. "You're nothing but a big bully who hurts people," she shouted angrily. My jaw dropped to the floor as I watched my little girl stand up for herself and for her doll friend. Although her words didn't really make any sense to me. "Oh. Is that right?" he chuckled, reaching down and grabbing Olivia by her hair and yanking her up to his eye line. Gasping, I stood to stop him, but I was suddenly held back by the strings that once tortured and hurt Travis. They wrapped themselves around my wrists and kept me back. "I'm not the real Charles, huh? And this stupid doll is, huh?" he snorted, laughing, snatching the doll from her little hands and dangling it in front of her as she screamed. "Let her go," I screamed as the strings tightened and began cutting into my wrists, drawing blood with how hard they were tightening. Creole giggled as he grabbed Olivia harder by the hair until he suddenly let out a grunt as suddenly dropped her to the floor. I watched as the little template doll stabbed Creole with a needle. The little doll then let itself go from Creole's grip and crawled up the Voodoo King's chest and up to his throat. "Get off me," he shouted, grabbing the doll only to be again stabbed by the doll, who then produced a razor blade from its mouth and in one swift motion sliced the stitches across Creole's throat. He gagged and clutched his throat as the black sludge that kept his body alive began leaking out of him. The strings around my arms let go, allowing me to run to Olivia and picked her up, the little doll latching to my ankle as I ran to the door. Creole clutched his throat as he stared at us run. I could feel the buttons burning into my skull as we ran from the shop. Seems Tempe, as he likes to be called, does claim to be the real Charles Sumner. Or more accurately, everything that he used to be. All the good that was Charles Sumner was placed into the doll, while the hatred and anger over his death was left to corrupt and decay into the horrible King Creole. I don't know if I believe him, but he saved my life. And even Creole and Samedi seem to know something about this little guy. I and Olivia will perform a seance with him to see if we can get in touch with the spirit stuck inside the doll. And maybe, just maybe, we can finally end the reign of King Creole. Setting Tempe down carefully on the table, I stared at him as he stared back up at me with his little button eyes. We stared at each other for an uncomfortable amount of seconds before Olivia finally came running back with her box of chalks and a couple candles from my room. "Thank you, sweetheart," I told her, taking her items and rewarding her with a forehead kiss. She smiled up at me and climbed into the chair next to me as I started drawing a circle around the template doll. It sprouted from a circle into a series of designs that, when I finally finished, covered the entire table around where Tempe was placed. "How is this supposed to let him talk to us, Mommy?" Olivia asked me, playing with a loose piece of chalk from her box. I sighed as I lit the candles and placed them in their designated spots. I wasn't sure that this would work at all. In fact, I was almost sure that it would cause more harm than good. But at this point, it was the only kind of lead that I had. "The circle will keep his spirit trapped inside it so we can safely talk to him," I explained. I stood to go turn the lights off and stopped as I turned to look at Tempe sitting down on the counter. He looked at me and gave the slightest nod to me. Nodding back, I flicked off the lights and walked back to my chair with Olivia. Taking her hand in my own, I looked at her and gave her another comforting smile. "I call on the spirit of Charles Sumner to come forth and speak to us," I told whatever spirits were hanging around the seance. I closed my eyes and gripped Olivia's hand as I waited for something to happen. And something did happen. I smelt burning. Opening my eyes quickly, I saw that the entire table was becoming engulfed in flames as the candles were suddenly shooting 3-foot flames into the ceiling. Flinching hard, I quickly grabbed Olivia and pulled her away from the table. Tempe sat still as the smoke and fire coalesced around him and soon obscured him completely. I nearly thought that something had gone wrong and that we had lost our only hope of saving Travis. But as suddenly as the fire had become uncontrollable, it immediately died down, and on the table was sitting a young man. His skin was tannish and his hair was black and messy. Looking at him, it seemed impossible for me to remember who he was. But imagining that those soft hazel eyes being replaced with buttons snapped me back to who this was. "Bonjour," he chuckled awkwardly, waving to me and Olivia from his position on the table. He sat there with his legs crossed and a soft smile on his face. I and Olivia looked at each other in shock, but slowly we approached the table together. "Charles Sumner?" I asked him. He let out another awkward chuckle and rubbed his head with his hand, seemingly tugging at the back of his hair. It certainly has been a while since anyone has called me by my real name, he said with a look of both happiness and a little sadness as well. I looked down at Olivia, who was already calm as any little kid can be near a strange man sitting on her table. But yes, he began again. I'm Charlie Sumner. Or Tempe if you'd like. He smiled, his teeth nice and white, and that smile alone calming me down. So, you really are the real Charles? I asked him, picking up my knocked over a chair and sitting down in it, far enough away from him to be safe if he tried anything funny. Charles shrugged and looked around the room for a second. I wouldn't say that King Creole is the fake Charles Sumner either, he corrected me, sighing as he sat with his knees pulled up to his chin, resting his head on his knees. I guess you can call us the sides of a coin, he explained, like Dr. Jelly and Mr. Hyde. Olivia spoke up, raising her little hand up to draw our attention to her. We both looked down at her and offered her a little snicker. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, sweetie, I told her, seemingly blowing her mind that she had been saying it wrong this entire time. Charles joined me in a little chuckle, but he shook his head after a little bit. It isn't like that exactly. It's more like this. He suddenly shifted to more comfortable and began to explain it to the best of his ability. After I was murdered and brought back, I wasn't instantly King Creole. I was still Charles Sumner. But learning what Mary did to me caused me to lash out and do what I did to her and her accomplices, he explained, looking at the two of us to see if we were still following along. Well, I kept all that anger and rage built up inside of me. I didn't have anyone to talk to except my mama, and I didn't expect her to understand how I felt, being brought back to life and having killed and cursed so many people. And one day I guess all that built up anger and rage split into a completely different creature. He sighed, his breath shaky as he put his face into his hands. King Creole. I finished for him. So how can we stop him? We've tried everything to beat him, I asked him, to which he responded with a shrug, sending my stomach to the floor. I don't know. His spirit is resilient. You saw the other Travis's soul. Those kinds of souls seem to have endless energy inside them. They just refuse to give up. He sighed, looking around the kitchen and taking in his surroundings. Everything's a lot smaller when you aren't a doll. He chuckled. What about Baron Samedi? He offered to help if we got Travis's souls to him. Charles scoffed at that. What he'll probably do is take the souls with him. Probably the first of Creole's new tribute to him. He responded to us, suddenly his tan face going pale and backing up quickly from the table. I raised a brow at him, but the freezing cold hand being placed on my shoulder shocked me into staying still. How right you are. The familiar voice of Travis with that newly soft southern accent sent me into panic mode as I quickly turned to meet him, only to receive a smack at the back of the head by a hard object, sending me down to the kitchen floor. Get away from me, Olivia shouted, running away from Creole and quickly climbing up onto the table to cower with Charles. I heard the steps of his dress shoes and the tapping of his cane as he passed me. I reached an arm out to try and stop him, only to have it stepped on by his shoes. I do owe you a big thanks, Alexandra, he told me, a smile on his face as he lowered his face to meet mine as he began grinding his foot into my hand. You made it much easier to finally rid myself of him. I could only assume he was talking about Charles. I swear to God I'll fucking rip your head off if you touch Olivia. I snarled at him, letting out a restrained grunt as he pressed even more weight onto my hand. The sickening crunch that came afterward caused me to let out an agonized scream. No need for such foul language. I thought you Brits were taught better than that. He chuckled, letting my hand go from his vice-like grip and sending a blow right to my ribs, taking the breath out of me. Don't hurt my mommy. Olivia's voice brought me back from the brink of passing out in pain. Looking up, I saw that she had launched herself at Creole and was frantically beating her with her little hands as she clung to him. She clung to his back as she tried to protect me from him. My, certainly a brave effort, Creole growled. Seconds from getting her off his back when the unmistakable sound of a frying pan hitting him rang out in the kitchen. He stumbled forward and began slumping against the wall. Straining my neck, I saw that Charles had managed to reach out and grab a frying pan from the sink and had struck his alter self with it. End the seance, he quickly shouted, looking down at the still flaming candles and the circle keeping him trapped on the table. Not fully understanding why he wanted that, I simply nodded and crawled over to the table. grabbing the nearest candle I could reach from the floor. I snuffed out against the floor and sighed hard as they all went out, leaving me and Olivia in darkness. Where did he go? Olivia's scared voice asked me as she quickly came running over to me and helped me get up to my knees. I looked around our darkened kitchen, still expecting to see Creole against the wall. But to my surprise, he wasn't anywhere to be seen. Looking at the table I saw that Tempe was still sitting on his spot on the kitchen table. He must have been called here by the seance. It is a part of his soul after all. I sighed, mentally smacking myself for not foreseeing the possibility of this happening. I really must stop doing these seances. If anything, they've just caused nothing but problems. Sitting up and gripping my head as it spun, I managed to get up straight and walk over to Tempe. "What do we do now, Mommy?" Olivia asked me. I looked over to her as I picked Tempe up and handed him to her. She wrapped her arms around him and looked up at me, still waiting for an answer from me. And I didn't have one for her. It truly felt like I had nowhere else to go. No way at all to save Travis. "I don't know, sweetheart. I really don't." I sighed, sitting on the chair and letting out a hard sigh as I touched the back of my head, wincing at the sting I felt back. I looked over to Olivia, who was busy whispering something at Tempe. I raised a brow at that. It had never crossed my mind that she was able to talk to him without the need for a seance. Otherwise, how else had she known that I was in danger at the Voodoo store? "Mommy." Her excited voice quickly brought me out of that train of thought and I looked down at her. "Tempe says that maybe he can help us after all," she said quickly, jumping up and down and holding the little template doll up in the air as she did so. I looked at them both with doubts, but I listened to their plan. Olivia did her best to describe it and I listened to both of them. "Can that even work? I mean, honestly, you two. That has to be really one of the brashest ideas ever." I snuffed at them. Olivia held Tempe up to her ear and nodded as he seemingly whispered to her. She nodded and looked back at me. "He says to tell you that it isn't as dumb as you rushing in there with only a knife," she said with a straight face. I sighed and shook my head. Well, he wasn't wrong about that one. So I finally nodded, standing up and walking over to the two of them. "We might as well try it. Because if it doesn't work, we're all going to be screwed." I chuckled nervously, picking the two of them up with a grunt and walking off to go and prepare everything we were going to need. This included some more chalk, candles, a branch from the tree outside, and of course a bottle of Olivia's old mother's booze. All packed up, the three of us waited till nightfall and made our way out towards the Voodoo store. We weren't expecting it to be closed. It is open 24 hours after all. In fact, the whole plan was expecting the store to be open and for King Creole to be there. Lucky enough for us, he was currently dealing with the man I had seen him with the last time he was there. I wonder how badly getting rid of his wife had messed him up. "Okay, Tempe. Show Olivia the right circles to draw. And Olivia, be careful not to burn yourself or Tempe. We have to get this right or it isn't going to work at all," I told the two of them as we hid in the alley next to the store. They both nodded up at me, and with one final hug of Olivia, I stood and went back to the door. Just in time to see the undead corpse of a woman shambling into the store right before me. Keeping my mouth shut to keep me from screaming, I let her go ahead. I peeked into the store as I saw the woman shambling over towards who I could only guess was her husband. The old zombie trick, he must be running out of ideas. The man let out a blood-curdling scream as the undead woman latched onto him and began biting into his neck. I watched as Creole chuckled to himself as the body was eaten in front of him. Taking this opportunity, I entered the store again and quickly dropped my purse in the door to keep it from closing all the way. I wasn't going to let him lock me in here again. He looked over at the door, most likely expecting another customer, but his smile quickly turned into an angry scowl as he saw me. "Don't you have anything better to do than annoy me?" he asked, sitting up straight and walking past the counter over to me. His displeasure rose with each step towards me. I stood my ground as he walked closer to me. "If you give me Travis back, this could all be over," I told me, puffing out my chest to meet his gaze as he finally stood mere inches from me. He chuckled at me and raised a brow at me. I can still never shake the horror of seeing Creole's mannerisms coming from Travis's body. It hurts my heart terribly to see it. "You know I can't do that. And ain't nothing going to convince me neither." He smiled at me, reaching his hand out and calmly grabbing me by the throat. I took the chance to inhale deeply and store as much air in my lungs as I could before he began to put pressure onto my windpipe. I stared at him with as much hatred as he stared back at me. And then I made a smile at him. Gotcha. I coughed out at him. He raised a brow at me before he was tackled from behind by the undead woman, sending the both of us forward and, thanks to the ajar door, stumbling forward into the street. His grip loosened on me and quickly crawled away from him and the woman. "You rotting whore," he snarled, grabbing the woman by her hair and jamming his fingers into her eye. Her whole body soon began to disintegrate and disappear into the night in a cloud of ash. He turned to look at me just as I placed the last candle down on the floor. He stared at the symbol on the floor and then at the candles, and he quickly began crawling to try and blow one of them out. "Hold," I shouted at the floor. The chalk symbols glowing and Creel's hand stopping inches away from the candle. He looked around like the trapped rodent he was, smashing against a seemingly invisible box around him and clawing at it for some sort of escape. "You sneaky bitch," he snarled, standing up and looking at me and then Olivia, who quickly ran to my side with Tempe in tow. "You realize this can't hold me very long, correct?" He snuffed at me. I nodded to him, picking up Olivia and walking around the circle towards the Voodoo store entrance. "But it will hold you long enough to save Travis," I said with a raised head, as I and Olivia returned one last time to the half-priced Voodoo store. Stepping into the store was eerie. While every time I went in knowing what to expect, this time the entire store sent off an almost paralyzing sense of fear into me. Olivia, as normal, was just excited to be inside again. She hugged Tempe tightly as the pair went about looking for where Travis's soul might be kept. "Don't wander out of my sight," I told her as she started towards Creel's office. She looked up at me and gave me a strange look. She then looked back at the office and pointed towards it. I raised my brow at her and looked over at the office, then back at her. "What is darling?" I asked her. "You don't hear the phone ringing, mommy?" she asked me with a look of absolute confusion on her face. I looked at her and then up over to the office door. I didn't hear anything but the creaking of the old wood and the soft chittering sounds of mice in the walls. I couldn't hear anything that sounded like a telephone ringing. Alright, you go to the office and answer it. Just don't touch anything, dear," I told her. To which she nodded and went to the door, keeping it open and walking inside to answer whatever imaginary phone she thought she heard. I meanwhile went about trying to locate any kind of lead on where Travis's soul might have been being kept. I looked once again behind the counter, on the back wall, and even to the wall of new voodoo dolls. But nothing called to me as being where Travis was being kept. "Olivia, are you done in there?" I asked her, walking over and letting myself into King Creel's office. I looked around the rather messy looking office with a soft calling to tidy it up. But I pushed that down and walked over to Olivia, who was sitting on Creel's chair and talking on a rotary telephone. "What's a math head?" she asked me when she saw I was in the office with her. "This man is calling about some math heads. Does that mean someone who really loves math?" she asked me. I looked at her just as confused as she no doubt was. I took it from her and put it up to my ear. "Who is this?" I asked. On the other end, I heard nothing but a dial tone. Then a hard sigh and the sound of someone shifting in a chair. "You're that limey bitch that Charles keeps complaining about," a tired and annoyed voice of a man told me from the other end. "Where is that idiot with the meth heads he promised me?" he said, his voice becoming one of anger now. "He's indisposed right now. I'll pass it along," I told him, not having the time to talk to whoever this was on the other end. I was about to hang up the call, but suddenly a garbled and sloshing noise came from the other end. "Tell that bastard to give me what he owes me," the voice suddenly said. It came in distorted and almost impossible to hear clearly. I pulled the phone away as it began to ooze the black sludge that normally comes out of Creel when he's damaged. I quickly slammed the phone back on its receiver and backed away from it. "Olivia, don't answer that anymore," I told her quickly. To which she nodded, still confused about the whole process. No doubt still confused as to what a math head was. We quickly switched gears into looking for the bottles with Travis's soul. I was about to give up hope when Olivia suddenly tugged on my sleeve and pointed down at the floor. "Tempe says try right there," she said, hugging the doll into her chest as she looked up at me. I stared at her for a moment before getting on my knee and knocking on the creaky old floorboards. Most of them sounded hollow until I got to a spot right next to Creel's chair which sounded hollow. I quickly dug my nails into the opening spaces between them and pried it open. Staring back at us were the two bottles. The red one was still trying in vain to escape, while the blue one was still idle at the bottom, seemingly never having moved from where it had fallen. I nodded quickly and let the floorboard fall back down into place. Looking at Olivia and Tempe, I offered them both a smile and kissed Olivia on the head. "Good job, sweetie," I said with a loving smile. Quickly standing up and heading for the door into the main floor of the shop. And right into Creel, who had certainly seen better days. It looked like he had been hit by a train, his body was ragged and black ooze dripped from cuts all over his body. Quite the spell. But not enough to hold me. He chuckled. It was impossible, the spell still had a few more minutes left in it. I looked over at where we had trapped him and sure enough, the candles were still breathing and the chalk line was still in place. "How did you escape?" I asked him, pushing Olivia behind me and handing her the bottles to hold onto. Creel chuckled, letting out long haggard breaths as he looked at me with his button eyes. His pale face contorting into a scowl as he pushed his mangled body to stand up straight. "Sometimes, brute force is all you need." He chuckled, suddenly going into a coughing fit and hacking up more of the black sludge that kept him and by extension, Travis's body alive. I looked back at the prison spell and then at him. "You didn't," I said, finally realizing he had simply thrown himself at it over and over again to simply force his way through it. The equivalent of running into strong glass and being cut by all the shards. Sometimes it's the simplest ways that are also the hardest. He chuckled at me, wiping his mouth and standing up straight as the cuts and bruises began to slowly heal themselves. "I must thank you for answering that phone call for me, Olivia dear." "Who was it?" he asked her as she poked her head out from behind me. "Some sad-sounding man asking for math heads," she said quickly, sticking her tongue out at him when she was done. Quickly hiding behind me again and gripping me with her hands as she kept the bottles tucked under her armpits. Creel looked as confused as I was when she said that, but soon he was able to put two and two together and nodded knowingly. "Sinclair," he chuckled, sking as he shook his head. "He's going to give me hell for not answering that." "Oh well, he can wait," he said, turning around and walking over to the counter. Reaching over it and pulling out his cane as the last of his injuries healed. "What are you going to do?" I asked, trying to build up a bit of courage that I had. "Beat us to death with that?" Hopefully, that hadn't given him any ideas. He looked over at me and chuckled. His smile spread up to his red-painted cheeks. "Nothing so sweet and simple." He hummed at me, raising the cane at us and slamming it down in front of him, sending a loud smacking sound across the store. The wood shaking and things falling from the shelf. Olivia whimpered and quickly went to hug me as hard as she could. I put an arm behind me to pat her head, trying to keep strong for her. "You see," Creel said after the shaking had stopped. "Your little stunt with the undead whore has given me a wonderful idea. Why not just bring back the two people who scare you so much more than I do?" he said with a childlike giggle. "What do you mean?" I asked him. My question soon answered by the floorboards in front of him exploding and two sets of arms clawing their way up from there. I recognized one immediately as the flesh began to return to her rotting corpse. Olivia's old mother Sophie. Her eyeless sockets stared at Olivia and instantly sent her into a screaming fit. The other body was at first unfamiliar to me. Even as more and more skin was added to his body, it was still impossible to remember who this was. That is until his mouth opened and he began screaming at me. "Alex, you bloody whore. Leaving me with the fucking brats, eh?" he shouted at me as he pulled himself to his feet. My blood ran cold as I backed up and fell down next to Olivia, who was bawling her eyes out as Sophie crawled her way to us. Her body was still trapped between being half human and half doll, and she used her one good arm to crawl her way towards us. "Billy, please. I couldn't raise your children." My voice trembled as my ex-husband made his way over to me and grabbed me by the hair. His nails dug into my scalp as he pulled me up. All those horrible memories of being his wife, being forced to bear his children, and the night I managed to escape all came running back to me. "Left me to deal with them brats after you took off to this place." He spat at me as he pushed me to the wall behind us near Creel's office door. I trembled as I looked up at his rotting face. Suddenly though Olivia screamed out and I looked to see that Sophie had her hand around her throat. "You little spoiled brat. Look what you fucking did to me." She screamed at Olivia while she tried to kick and get the half-human and doll hybrid away from her. The bottles she was holding now on the floor as Creole walked to go pick them back up, happily chuckling to himself. I looked back at Bill as I thought about all I had gone through to get away from him. Then all I had done to take care of Olivia. She mattered more to me than anything in the world. She's my daughter and I will protect her. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed Bill by the head and slammed his head into the wall next to me. "Ah. You'll pay for that, you 2-cent whore," he cried, gabbing his cracking face as I quickly ran to Olivia. Grabbing Sophie by the hair and yanking her away from Olivia. Staring at her sockets as I gritted my teeth at her. "Don't touch my daughter," I screamed at her, grabbing a loose floorboard from their initial entrance and striking her on the head with her. Turning quickly and striking Bill with it while he was still dealing with his face. I panted hard as I kicked Sophie away further and quickly picked up Olivia. She was still crying and even hyperventilating, and I tried my best to calm her down. "My, how very brave," Creole said with a chuckle. I turned to quickly look at him, my heart sinking as he tossed the blue bottle up and down in his hand. I swallowed as I backed up with Olivia in my arms. Something came to my mind as I realized she was hugging me with both arms. Where was Tempe? My answer came moments later when Creole let out a surprised growl as he was suddenly missing a button eye. I looked at him in shock and surprise when I saw Tempe had managed to climb up onto his hat and had suddenly cut one of the buttons from his eyes out. Looking down to the floor, I quickly put Olivia down and picked up the floorboard piece. Creole looked up at me as I shouted out and caught him upside the head with his. A sickening crack coming from him as the board snapped in half. "Did you really think that would work?" he shouted at me, but his tone changed when I grabbed him by the tie and grabbed his remaining button eye with my fingers and tore it from his face. "Ah. You goddamn whore," he screamed at me as he stumbled backward and twisted his head back and forth rapidly. I quickly picked up the bottle he had dropped when I struck him and grabbed the other red bottle from the floor. "Olivia. Let's go, baby," I said to her. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and quickly nodded. Running past her crumbling and rotting mother as she scooped up Tempe from the floor and ran towards me and the exit. I waited until she was safely outside before turning to watch Bill also crumble to dust as Creole stumbled around trying to find his buttons. "Goodbye, Bill," I said, more for me than for him. I was safe from him forever, and with a daughter who I loved with all my heart. I clutched the bottles and quickly left the store as Creole shouted after me. "Good luck doing anything with those," he screamed at me, his laugh picking up intensity as we ran away from the store. "I can't wait to see what you whip up," he cackled as we finally managed to get out of earshot from him. I took a moment to comfort Olivia by the side of the road as she bawled her eyes out. Even Tempe hugged her leg as we both did our best to calm her down. Arriving back home, I quickly put her to bed with Tempe. Leaving her nightlight on, I went to the kitchen and let out an exhausted sigh as I placed the bottles on the table. The red one was still trying to escape, throwing itself against the sides of the bottle over and over again. I picked up the blue bottle and stared at it with a sigh. Creole was right. What was I meant to do with them now? "You can hand them to me," a shrill voice suddenly told me. I stood up and backed away from the table as I stared at a familiar face. "Le Baron Samedi. I won't let you take them. Not if they count as Creole's tribute to him," I said, clutching the bottle close to my chest. But the Baron simply shook his head and walked past me over to the fridge. I backed away from him, also sliding the red bottle over towards me. "Look, that cockroach's days are numbered. I can see the writing on the walls and I need a way to get back what I've lost in investments," he said, opening up the fridge and letting out an annoyed tsk. "No liquor. What kind of fucking house is this?" He looked over at me with an annoyed look. I stared at him and crossed my arms at him. "I'll give you some," I said, pulling the bottle of booze out from under the table and placing it down in front of him. "If you and I make a deal," I said. He stared at me, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. He came over and sat down on the other side of the table. "I'm listening, bitch," he said, pulling out a cigar and placing it in his mouth. Eagerly waiting to see what my proposition was. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and laid it all out for him. "I want Travis back. Not as a puppet, but as a human," I told him. And he shook his head back at me. "Can't. He's been dead too long. Same with his family, can't bring them back either. Unless you want them as fucking zombies," he said with a smirk, puffing away at his cigar. I nodded, knowing as much. "But I had heard you ask for the impossible, so you can get what you want. Then take away the murderous tendencies he's gotten. Put the soul back together and let him sleep," I told him. To this, he let out an audible hum, nodding to me as he blew out a perfect smoke ring. "Interesting. Go on, this is seemingly like fun," he said with a smile. "And give him back his eyes. Let him sleep so this never happens again," I said, sliding the liquor closer to him. A tempting offer for him. He stared at it and licked his lips, seemingly desperate for a drink. And this is all I get for my hard work." He pointed at the bottle. Definitely tempted for it, but also trying to contain himself. "There must be more," he told me. "You get Creole. And all those souls he has trapped in the Voodoo store." His eyes lit up at that. He slowly lifted his hand up to the cigar and took it from his mouth, staring at me and chuckling. "Truly an excellent deal," he nodded, reaching out to take the bottle before I reached out and pulled it back over to me. "Not until I have your assurances that he'll stay in hell," I told him. He looked at me suddenly annoyed and backed away from the bottle. He tilted his head back and forth before finally nodding. "Deal." He nodded, to which I finally passed him the bottle. He took it with a smile and bit the end off, guzzling down the liquor with a pleased hum. I nodded with a smile as I stood up and walked off towards Olivia's room, leaving the bottles there for the Baron to work his magic. Walking up to her room, I noticed that the light was out. Entering, and I soon found the reason why. "Take another step and I cut her head off," Creole growled at me in the dark, the nightlight shining brightly soon afterward and revealing that Creole had his hand over Olivia's mouth and a knife across her throat. I gasped and wanted to take a step towards him, but the slight flinch I made towards him caused him to hold the knife closer to her throat. So I complied and stood my ground. "Don't hurt her," I begged. He looked down at her as tears rolled down her throat. And then back at me. He gritted his yellow teeth as he seemingly wrestled with his decision. His mother had always made it a point to him to never harm a child. "Y'all are leaving me no choice," he chuckled, standing up and keeping Olivia against his chest and walking towards me. I backed up away from him and swallowed hard. "If you are playing dirty, I suppose so must I," he declared, pushing the knife closer to her throat. Olivia suddenly squirmed and drove her little foot into his crotch. Creole let out a surprised scream and dropped her suddenly. Olivia ran to me and got behind me. "It's over, Charles," I told him. The Voodoo King looked up at me as he looked around like a caged animal. A soft chuckle coming from his throat as he forced himself up, staring at me with buttons from his suit and looking down at Olivia, who was now clutching Tempe. "Au revoir pour le moment," he said with a smile as he rolled his head around and suddenly collapsed to the floor, falling to his knees and then on his face as we went limp. We both looked at each other, then behind us, when someone cleared their throat. The Baron waved to us as he held up the liquor bottle I had given him, which was now filled to the brim with a black sludge. "It's done, mon, cheery," he said with a nod to me, pointing over to the limp body as it suddenly pushed itself up and looked around, his eyes blinking in confusion and then looking up at us. "Travis," I shouted as I quickly walked over to him and helped him to his knees and hugged him, even Olivia running over and hugging him. Travis really was back. "Hey guys. Been a while, hasn't it? I guess Alexandra has been filling you in on everything while I was gone. And she's the reason I'm here now again. Having my eyes back is certainly weird. Blinking feels so weird, and being able to fall asleep for the first time in God knows how long felt amazing. Even if it was only for 2 hours. While the rest of my body is still pale and the scar is still across my throat, I've slowly been going back to a real sense of normalcy. Being able to actually eat, see, cry, everything I've missed feels simply amazing. Day-to-day life with Alexandra and Olivia is going along well, while Alexandra still keeps an eye on me. I wouldn't blame her, after all, I did try to murder her and was possessed. And in other pretty good news, I applied to college. I figured I might as well do it, since I would much rather suffer through any kind of bullshit class than go back to the workforce. My current experience with it has certainly scarred me. I'm sure some of you are wondering how the hell I'll be able to do that looking the way I do. Well, Makeup exists for a reason, right? And maybe even online classes. Either way, I'm never going back to the Voodoo store for as long as I live. I've learned my lesson. I have a pretty good life here with Alexandra and Olivia. I pick Olivia up from school, and she shows me off to her friends when they don't believe her brother had his head cut off and lived. Brother. Definitely a weird thing to hear from a 20-year-old single child. But she definitely feels like my little sister now. There really isn't too much left to tell you guys. Other than the occasional nightmare, I don't really like to think of all King Creoles. I have the scars to show what I've gone through, and I would never go back there. I guess this is the end of this. Unless something horrible ends up happening. From Travis, I worked at the half-priced Voodoo store. Au revoir mon chéri. The end. If you like this series so far, subscribe.